So Jon Kabat-Zinn, welcome to this hut or shelter. It used to be a shelter for workmen, but nowadays it's the studio where we have our weekly conversation about faith with people of various backgrounds. So welcome to this little place in the outskirts of Denmark.
Thank you. It's incredible to be here.
Jon, is there such a thing as a short definition of what mindfulness is?
Yeah, I have two one-word definitions of mindfulness, but one-word definitions are hard to understand. But the two one-word definitions would be, number one, mindfulness is relationality. Okay? And the other would be mindfulness is awareness, or pure awareness. So if I say either of those things, people won't have the slightest idea what I'm really talking about. So my sort of working operational definition of mindfulness is that it's the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So if you start to think about that for a minute, well, paying attention, okay, we all do that, or we can do that, but often our attention is grabbed by this or that, and a lot of the time we're not paying attention, we're on autopilot, zoning along through our moments and missing a lot. So paying attention on purpose, that means you intentionally cultivate your relationship to your own capacity for being present, for attending, on purpose, in the present moment, the only moment any of us ever have to learn, to grow, to make anything happen, to do anything, or to love. It's only now. Past is gone, future hasn't happened. So paying attention on purpose in the present moment, and then the non-judgmentally part. That doesn't mean that you won't have judgments. It means that you'll become aware very rapidly of just how judgmental you are, and you won't judge that. And so then you're already in awareness. But you're in a space of, the freedom to actually see things unfolding without making a big personal story out of it. Like, I like this, I don't like that, which is where, if you start to pay attention to your own mind, we're judging all the time. I want more of this, I want less of that, I don't like her, I like him, on and on and on. And also, most of the time we're not in the present moment at all. We're living in our heads in the future, planning or worrying. I guess that's true in Denmark too, not just in the United States. And also in the past where, we're thinking about why this happened and who's to blame and why I'm the way I am now and trying to understand it all about the past. But that's all over. And the more we generate stories about it with awareness, the more you realize no matter what story or narrative you are generating about your life, there's a mysterious element of who's generating these stories that's much bigger than the story. And so the awareness that the word mindfulness is pointing to is an awareness that is beyond all stories. And therefore is, right from the beginning, a way of liberating yourself from stories about reality that are maybe partly correct, but they're never completely correct. And in a sense, they're way too small. So your story about how sad I am, or how angry I am, or how hopeless I am, or how great I am, they may be true to a degree, but they're not true enough. And the you that's already capable of awareness, or mindfulness, or heartfulness, is already here. It's not something you need to get. It's something that you already are.
Jon, when I sit and I watch these flowers, and right now we are in a moment when the flowers are just opening for the spring, it's beautiful. Then I think in short moments I'm where there are no sort of stories. Is this also mindfulness?
Of course.
These moments.
Of course.
In everyday life.
Absolutely. I mean, it's all about everyday life. There's nothing that's not everyday life. Even if you're formally meditating or think you're formally meditating within the larger context, within the larger context of your life and your breath and what's going on. So in some way, in some very, very important way, the real meditation practice is life itself. It's not formally positioning yourself in what you think is a meditative practice or posture.
But would the untrained mind also experience moments of natural moments of
Absolutely.
mindfulness?
Look at how people relate to sunsets, or sunrises, or particular moments when the clouds are doing amazing things. Children, for instance, do that all the time, lying in a field and just looking up and watching what the clouds are doing. You could say it's magical. Well, yes, it is magical, but so is everything if you start to really see it. And you get, again, underneath your thoughts about it. Now, children, they don't have so many thoughts about it, so they can really perceive things as they are. As we get older, we have more and more sort of thoughts that interface themselves between ourselves and our capacity for deep seeing.
So let us take a few sort of natural moments of that relate to mindfulness. Now I say something, looking at my wife, falling in love with her, being in love with her.
Well, that's a beautiful example. And, those of us who have relationships with other human beings that we would describe as love or love affairs, yes, there was always that moment of first meeting. But after 30 or 40 years, how is it? And so the question is, like, if it's really love, does it ever end? Is it really limited by conditions, for instance? So a lot of the time, if we're not careful, we can fall in love with who we think the other person is, and after a while, it doesn't work so well because it's contrived or constrained by those. But if, like, one is really in love, then it's independent of time and space.
Yeah, but you had this phrase, magic moments, the awareness of the magic moments.
Yes, so there are special magic moments, and it turns out they're everywhere. There's no moment that's actually not magical if you're willing to be in relationship to it. And that's why I sometimes define mindfulness as relationality. It's like, okay, how am I going to be in relationship to my sitting here in conversation with you? And the fact that there's actually a camera as well, but and there may be a much larger audience in the universe, but we're here together in this beautiful space. So I could choose to be in relationship to in many different ways, one of which would be to try to put on a certain kind of air about what I need to say to get out to the world. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is a spontaneous connection between you and me. And as far as I'm concerned, at this particular moment, it's a love affair as well. And not just you and me, because we're connecting in some way, but a love for why you set this up in the first place, why we're talking about mindfulness and not farming or whatever else it could be. And to me, that's very, very interesting, is what are our relationships with each other that would bring out the beauty between us and around us.
Because in a way, you can also say, now we sit here and have this conversation, and we can be mindful or aware of, the words, the formulations. But I don't know if you have the same feeling that there is this little place in the heart where there is a soft spot opening in the moment,
and that you could say is magical. And my aspiration is that would be true for everybody that's watching it. That in some way, the connection between you and me is a sort of, in some sense, viral or infectious. That people could feel that what we're talking about is a kind of intimacy with the beauty of the present moment, even in circumstances that may be very unbeautiful, very problematic, very painful, horrible even, because there's a lot of horror going on in the world. But there's also beauty at the same time, and also the possibility for, in some sense, addressing the horror and attenuating some of that horror that we may be ultimately more responsible for than we're willing to admit as individuals.
There is this saying of Dostoevsky that the world should be saved by beauty.
Is that so? Yeah. I love that.
No, but I mean, this about how these magic moments of presence or of beauty or of love, in spite of everything, can somehow put a different light on.
Absolutely. It's a certain kind of a lens. Or you could say that it's the absence of any lens. So if you take away all the lenses through which we look at the world and at our own experience, the biggest lens is the personal pronouns. Me, myself, I, my life, my aspirations, my success, my failure, my depression, my anger. It's all I, me, mine, mine. My love, maybe my love for you is more about me than it is for you. That would be a problem. So if you in some sense allow that attachment to the story of me to just dissolve a little bit or fade a little bit, then the beauty is already here. It's always present.
Now, mindfulness has become very, very popular in the West.
Yes, it's true.
And is it because we have this longing? And we know there is this possibility for beauty being present.
I hope so. I hope so. When these things reach a certain level of popularity in the mainstream, they can easily get corrupted and distorted and commercialized. And people are maybe have mindfulness on their lips, but they have no idea what it is. And while I give you a definition, a working definition of mindfulness, the actual cultivation of mindfulness is one of the hardest things in the world for us human beings to do, to be present for even 2 moments together, because we're so distractible. And even before iPhones, we were distractible, but now it's like infinitely distracted and addicted to that kind of distraction. And so if you're not careful, you may live your whole life and never be where you actually are. And then wake up just before you die and realize, I missed my whole life. And this would be a tragedy. And not just for yourself, but in a sense, the planet, the world needs each one of us to actually show up and live an awakened life, because when we're living on autopilot or more sort of asleep or unconscious than awake, then we give the planet a fever. Then we pollute our own, sort of water and air and minds. And we can only tolerate, it seems, a certain amount of that before forces get unleashed that are not really controllable by human beings. And we think that the climate is reaching that very, very critical point where once you unleash these kinds of nonlinear, dynamical, self-corrective systems, the consequences might be bigger than anything that's happened in the history of human beings, which is only 300 or 400 generations that there has been any history. If you think of a generation as 30 years, for instance, so you multiply that by 300, you get 9,000 years. Well, that's like about when the last ice age was. So everything that we love, that we consider to be human beauty, has really, the Louvre, all the great museums, all the great concert halls, the poetry and music and science and, Madame Curie and all of our understanding, that's all only 300 generations. It's like we're in our infancy as a species. And maybe what we need now as a species and what the planet needs is for us to live our way into the name we gave ourselves as a species, Linnaeus and those people, Homo sapiens sapiens, which means the species that knows and knows that it knows, or the species that is aware and knows that it's aware. And I don't think we've reached that point yet. So we're very precocious at naming ourselves that, but if the human species doesn't wake up pretty soon, then I think we're going to cause an enormous amount of harm that would be very hard to pull back from.
So, I mean, on one level, mindfulness has to do with, for instance, coping with stress and with coping with your life and so on. But from another dimension, do you then see the mindfulness movement as in a way, collective yearning or longing for finding a way to cope with these much bigger issues related to the future?
I see it being mindfulness having to do with the small or the personal and the large or the, sort of supra-personal. So, I do think that it has profound global implications that have to do with wisdom, living our way into the full dimensionality of what it means to be human, and also compassion, the deep appreciation for the interconnectedness and the interrelatedness of all things, all beings, and all human beings. And then when we realize that, when we make it real for ourselves in our lives, we'll treat each other differently, even if there are superficial differences among us. And when that's enacted, when that's embodied, then you get wisdom, you get beauty, you get kindness, you get empathy, you get the appreciation of the arc of a human life lived, and you nurture that in the same way as, like, often people do that with animals, and they treat the animals better than they treat their own family members or human beings. There's a lot of grief and sadness in that. But when we can, like, rotate in consciousness and wake up to the deep interconnectedness, then there's no separation between you and me. We will immediately live differently than if it's all about me and you're just a bit player in my movie.
In a way, Jon Kabat-Zinn, this has a lot to do with listening to where the universe is calling upon you. And you had in 1979 a significant experience where, in a way, the universe called upon you. I don't know if you can
share. Or it showed me something. The universe showed me something that I've been, like, asking myself for a very long time. And one way I put it is that for a long time, and I won't go into my own personal history and so forth, I was asking myself as a young man, what is my job on the planet? Really wanted to know, what is my job? I was trained as a scientist, in elite institutions like MIT, with a Nobel laureate working in his laboratory in molecular biology. But I was more interested in the mind and consciousness than anything else, and how evolution gave rise to awareness and consciousness. And so I kept asking myself, because the laboratory didn't seem big enough to answer those kinds of questions, and the technology wasn't good enough in those days, and it's still not good enough. What is my job on the planet with a capital J? In other words, what would I love so much I would pay to do that kind of work? So rather than a job being something where you get paid to work, this is like, what would you love so much you would pay to do it? Of course, you have to be young and you have to be crazy to ask those kinds of questions. And so for 10 years, I was basically open to that question and listening for various responses and trying all sorts of different things and using my training sometimes and sometimes not. And then on a meditation retreat, a 2-week-long Vipassana meditation retreat, about the 10th day, sitting in my room all by myself, and that's after 10 days of silence and like being with myself 24/7. In like a few seconds, this sort of, I don't know what to call it, so I call it a vision, just appeared to me of what I needed to do with my life. And it was to take my own meditation practice and my understanding of that, which came for the most part out of various Buddhist traditions from Asia, and make it available for people who could never hear it through that kind of language or those kinds of forms. Find the universality within the essence, which is really awareness, wisdom, compassion, and find new ways to language it and frame it so that anybody could understand it. Your parents could understand it. People who couldn't care less about awareness would value it, because we're all suffering from stress, pain, illness, aging, whatever it is. But we also have that kind of intimacy with beauty, with a sort of deep core of our own being that often kind of gets forgotten. And how could we wake people up to that in a way that they became more empowered to learn, grow, heal, and transform across the lifespan, starting from wherever they happen to be. So that's what gave rise to this new way of working called mindfulness-based stress reduction in the hospital. I created a clinic that hopefully was going to be a model, if it was successful, for clinics around the world. And that's really what happened.
How do you understand this experience? Do you understand it as what you could call it, a divine calling, a plan, or how do you understand getting such a vision? that in a way is a part of
I think that
transforming the
human
world?
beings are, we don't understand creativity. We don't understand imagination, how this happens, where it comes from. But I think what it is that we human beings are much, much more capable than we think of deep ways of knowing. And sometimes you have to rest for long periods of time in not knowing, which is its own kind of love affair with the world. Like, what is called for now? And you ask yourself that, but you don't fill it up with little dime store answers. You just wait and wait. And then that's where insight arises. That's where creativity, that's where the eureka moments of, sort of Archimedes and so forth. All of science really requires kind of not knowing. Get beyond what you know, because you need to know an awful lot, but still the not knowing that allows the new to emerge. And sometimes that emerges in the field of science, sometimes it emerges in the field of music, sometimes it emerges in the form of poetry, or like, how do you explain Shakespeare? I mean, in the English language, no one, in fact, a lot of sort of literary scholars say that Shakespeare is responsible for the English language, that he gave half of the words to the English language. They didn't exist before Shakespeare. So how do you understand that? How do you explain Dante? How do you explain Mozart? How do you explain Beethoven? How do you explain Marie Curie, the insights, and, or Einstein? So this is the kind of human, I don't know whether to call it inheritance or precocity, but we are a very, very amazing emergence on this planet. And I think the more we come to know ourselves, the more we can learn to live in ways that promote beauty and well-being and non-harming, and minimize the kind of craziness and harm and violence that we're also deeply capable of.
I've just read Stephen Batchelor, a Buddhist scholar. His book After Buddhism.
Yeah.
And here in Denmark, you have something called the Vækst Center, where you also see
Vækst
Buddhism in new ways. Do you see this emergency of mindfulness, and maybe also your vision related to a kind of re-contextualization of the Dharma in the West?
Yeah. The short answer is yes, I do. And it's interesting that you use the word recontextualizing, because, some Buddhists might say it's more decontextualizing and taking some pieces of it and abandoning other pieces that might be the most important or the most transcendent or the most enlightening. I obviously disagree with that perspective. But what we're really talking about is dharma, which is D-H-A-R-M-A. This is kind of, in the Buddhist tradition, it means a lot of different things, one of which is the teachings of the Buddha. Another is more like, it's like the Tao. It's the natural principle of the world. Things unfold according to this lawfulness. It's like the laws of gravity, the laws of physics. There's the law of craving and attachment. If you identify with something as I, me, or mine, if you want it, if you crave it, your whole life is oriented to getting what you want and pushing away what you don't want, the stress, the pain, the illness, the dying, and all of that. I don't want that, I want that. You're completely off balance. And what the Dharma is saying is that is a prescription for suffering. And that is a prescription for self-generated greed, self-generated anger, not wanting, hatred, and self-generated delusion. And when you realize that, when you hold that in awareness, then the whole thing evaporates and you're free instantly. So that's not a Buddhist frame. That's a human frame. So yes, there's this notion that MBSR is in some sense, you could say, a dharma vehicle without ever using the word dharma, or vehicle for that matter. But it's a skillful means for cultivating access to a wisdom that we don't have to get or acquire. Even through arduous meditation practice, it's already ours by virtue of being human. So it's in our DNA. It's in our chromosomes. It's in our breathing. It's in our bones. And when we cultivate intimacy with awareness, it's already here. So you don't have to work at getting to become a Buddha. You realize that you're already a Buddha in the sense of fully awakened being, or at least having the potential for wakefulness moment by moment by moment. So yes, there's a very, very deep connection there, but it's not about Buddhism. And there's this very famous story, very briefly, a young woman said about her parents. She said, when I'm a Buddhist, when I was a Buddhist, she said, because she chose to become a Buddhist. She wasn't born into a Buddhist family. When I chose to be a Buddhist, it drove my parents nuts, crazy. But when I'm a Buddha, nobody seems to mind at all.
No. Jon Kabat-Zinn, in a way you can say that you bring the tools of mindfulness into a society that is heading towards constant monitoring. You know, we are monitored in our smartphone with the sensors. We are monitored on the internet, and in a way, you could also see mindfulness as a way of inward monitoring. What kind of thoughts do you have about this thing? Because mindfulness is also being used for utilizing efficiency and all these kind of things.
First, I want to just take that question in. No one's ever asked me that question. And it's very profound. This is where the Dalai Lama's emphasis on motivation is really, really, really important. So for all these monitoring devices and sensors, you know, like the car is no longer a car. It's not a mechanical device. It's a computer on wheels. And it's monitoring everything. And pretty soon we don't need the human beings. We have self-driving cars. You know, I wonder about the sensors. You know, you have to have sensors all around the car so that it knows when it's going to crash into other cars. And I wonder what happens if you're driving through the mud and your sensors get covered over. And then all of a sudden the computer no longer knows whether there's a car close or not. How are they working with that? But the deeper question is, as we reach this sort of into this digitizing of everything, we're really simulating reality. Now, there are people who think that that's what the mind itself is a simulation. Even that's what life is. It's this kind of simulation, that it's all just information in the DNA and in the biology and so forth. So then how do we know that we're even alive, or we're not just some figment in some much larger simulation of the universe, or even a multiverse? Because now serious scientists, they talk about like our one Big Bang universe. That's only one of an infinite number of universes. So there's a lot of talk about this, a lot of conversation about it. But I think your question is really profound. And you know, just at least off the top of my head, the motivation has everything to do with it. Because if your motivation is to control people, or to understand what other people are doing for purposes that are for your own self-interest, then that, of course, is totalitarianism. It's the Brave New World. It's a nightmare. If it's in the service of compassion and wisdom, then I think that the digital age, because we're not going to go back, because there's no escaping from it, that I think, and don't forget, I mean, we are now going to be capable of changing our physical structure in some way. I mean, people talk about download yourself to a disc, you know, and then immortality, and Ray Kurzweil talks about that, and singularity and so forth. So these are things that in some sense they need to be taken seriously. But what I like to say is, at least relatively speaking, for the next 30 years or 100 years or whatever, while we still have the chance, before we become what they call wet-dry interfaces, where we have embedded sensors and memory upgrades and everything else in our own bodies, maybe we need to understand or discover or recover what the full human biological capacity is before we go into the silicon capacity of, you know, extra sensors or something like that. So that's why I do the work that I do, in the sort of deep conviction that we are miraculous beings, human beings. We are miraculous beings. We know almost nothing about the nature of our own minds, the nature of our own hearts, the nature of the deep interconnectedness that's reflected now, it seems like the biological source of empathy may be in regions called mirror neurons in the motor sensory motor cortex, that when you do something in movement, that my neurons register in the same way as your brain to make the, if you're lifting a cup, for instance, your neurons seeing me will do that in the same part of the brain. So we're resonating at the level of the brain and at the level of the heart in many different ways. So we're deeply interconnected. But the fundamental question has to do with the motivation.
But in a world where we are taught that when we are monitored, there is an economical purpose. We are in a way living in a world of efficiency and so on. And I mean, how do we find this motivation you are talking about, sort of relating that also to mindfulness? Because in a world where we look upon ourselves as often as tools,
economic agents,
we are economical tools, and being monitored and monitoring. I mean, how do we find the ethical, moral ground for entering the kind of mindfulness and awareness of the beauty that you are speaking about?
I can't believe you're asking me this. It's so deep and so beautiful, and the fact that you're bringing up the whole question of the sort of ethical foundation for all of this. And the answer is, I have no idea. I have a kind of deep conviction that we all need to be asking that kind of question and not coming up with such quick responses, such facile answers that seems okay, but it's not really deep. That this may be an inflection point for all of humanity. If we're going to go in a direction where we, in some sense, imprison ourselves and give away our authenticity and our power to whoever's monitoring all those sensors and, sort of like, it's like the Matrix. Okay, that there's like a kind of constructed reality where we, in some sense, are abandoning our own humanity and giving rise to forces that could be very much put to, evil use, real profound harming, based on greed, hatred, and delusion, the usual kinds of culprits. So we need to, in some sense, perhaps we're reaching a point on the evolution of the planet where we need to look at our own technological precocity, and before we instantiate too much of that kind of thing, which is driven by commercialism, by greed, by fear, terrorism. We have to know what everybody's thinking, because some of you may be terrorists trying to destroy what we love. Well, we can destroy what we love by reacting to those fears. So we need to be able to face our own fear individually and collectively, and then find liberating ways, ethical ways, ways that emphasize non-harming and wholesomeness as opposed to unwholesome, greed-driven, power-driven, and ultimately toxic ways to sort of concentrate power in the hands of the few and have everybody else be basically, sort of relegated to sort of the life of an underclass, so to speak. I mean, there's the real potential for that happening. And they make movies about this kind of thing. I think one of them is called Galactica or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but these futuristic science fiction movies where everybody's like just information and you have to prove from moment to moment who you are, but very dangerous, very dangerous. So this is where I think the Dharma is our best hope, as far as I can see, bar none on the planet, that if we don't discover our own nature and capacity for wakefulness and liberation and for autonomy, then we're going to give up, we're going to surrender our autonomy to our own ignorance, and the consequences are going to be horrible.
Jon Kabat-Zinn, thank you.
Wow, I can't believe you asked me that. It's phenomenal. This is like, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.